The bathroom in the train had about 8 inches of water with sewage in it. I mean, I've never seen a train like that ever before or since. It was pretty surprising. Various little minor adventures were happening all along the way. I can't mention all of them or even remember all of them. And there's a couple of X-rated ones that I don't need to mention either. In any case, I got off at the station by Palenque, walked into the town, found an inn. Nice middle-class family was running an inn, and it had probably 4, 5, 6 rooms. And every room was concrete floor, one hammock. I put down the pack, check it out. I was not, of course, used to hammocks. And you have a choice. You can sleep in the hammock or you can sleep on the concrete. And what I discovered for once I got adjusted to it, the best way to do it was sleep in the hammock one night and then sleep on the ground the next night. Then in the hammock the next night, the ground the next night. That's what worked the best. And hammocks are kind of unsteady. You have to lie slightly crosswise in them in order to sleep, and you have to sleep on your back. But once you got used to it, it's pretty comfortable. Anyway, that went on a while, and I started exploring the ruins of Palenque. I ended up going there 7 times. The ruins of Palenque were up the hill a ways from the town, and I started looking for campsites, and I found a campsite. I was walking in the forest, and it was maybe half a mile in from the road along a fairly wide trail. And as I was walking along that trail, I was scanning through the forest, and I met a Mayan woman. She was kneeling by a stream washing clothes, and she was in a white huipile, a ritual embroidered gown that the women wear in Maya land. And I had enough Spanish to say, I'd like permission to camp on your land over there on that hill. And she said, you'll have to ask my husband. So I went looking for the husband. When I found him, he was a regal type Mayan, mounted on a horse. You know, he had something of the blood royal in him even after 500 years. Very impressive gentleman. And I said, can I camp on that hillock over there? And he said, sure, go ahead. So I took my stuff up there, unrolled my tent, and made a campfire, and stayed there probably 6 or 7 days. And a couple of times I got caught at night and had to feel my way along the trail with my feet. But luckily, there were green and gold fireflies in the forest. And they're not like the Midwest fireflies that blink. These fireflies are 100% on all the time, green and gold lights. And it turns out that they would fly down the tube in the forest that the trail had naturally made. And so I could see where the trail was by seeing the green and gold fireflies fly down that tube. And sure enough, it was easy to navigate that half mile in the pitch dark, during the dark of the moon even. One of the disadvantages of that hillock was that there were lice. And there were leaves on the ground detritus, and there were lice in those leaves. And what I discovered, I'd get a fire going, and the lice would crawl up my legs. You know, I had shorts on and a light shirt. They would crawl up the legs, and I found I could chop and peel and chop a quarter of an onion or half of an onion before the lice reached my knees. And then I'd stop what I was doing, pick whatever lice were on there, pick them off off of my body and chop up the other half of the onion. So it was real struggle to get a meal together in those circumstances. But adapting to all that was part of the joy of the adventure, actually. And I had really put it this way: when I started that venture, I was dead-ended in my life. I was alcoholic, but unaware of it. Nothing was going my way. I had no prospects. And so I was really asking the universe the question, do I have anything left to do on this planet? And the fact that I could do all that risky behavior and survive indicated to me, yeah, there's something else I have to do. And oddly enough, these videos are one of the things that I need to do. And partly, I admit, just to get it out of my system, and partly I can spin a good yarn. It's all true, but I can spin the yarn. So I guess the tales are worth listening to if you can get over the fact that you're listening to a doddering old man who's ever repeating himself. I repeat some of these experiences in my mind until I can become free of them. Or enjoy them, as the case may be. Because there were many enjoyable experiences there. In the next field over, there were 2 campesinos. I don't know if they were Mayan or not. I don't think they were Mayan. But they were sawing on a log. And the whole time I was there, the 10 days, they would come up during the day and they would saw on that log. And just before I left, I saw them carrying some lumber out. And they had a beam that was maybe yay by yay and pretty long, that they had carved out of that log. And it practically was carved. I've never seen a piece of wood that beautiful. It was all hand planed. Good grief. Beautiful piece of wood. I hope they got a lot for it because they put a lot of effort into it. Anyway, so I interacted with them. And I also made friends with a Mayan drunk from Bonampak, and we'd drink in the cantina together once in a while. And I almost went with him to Bonampak, but it didn't quite work out. He was unreliable. I said, I'll meet you here, in 2 days, and we'll go to Bonampak. And I went where the meeting would have been, and he wasn't there. It's a totally different perspective of time and situation. It's all much more spontaneous, much more organic, and I can't begin to describe the mood in the tropics. It's just different. The energy is different. Time flows differently. The air, especially, the quality of the air, it was so amazing. And you get so you can tune into variations in the air. Like I think the temperature was somewhere around 70 degrees constantly in February in Chiapas. And I'd barely notice it getting down to 68 or something. And somebody that I was interacting with would say, "Frio, it's cold today." So since the temperature varies but little, the fine-grained sensitivity to temperature increases. There's all kinds of interesting and strange things about the tropics that you gradually notice. I would say, if I had to sum it up, that the good things are gooder and the bad things are badder. Bad things, I'd walk along my trail and see a piece of a very colorful dead snake. Because the peasants that go along there, or the Mayans that go along there, campesinos, I guess Mayans are mostly campesinos. Anyway, they all carry machetes. And they see a deadly snake and they kill it. And a piece of that snake was left by the trail. I would not leave that trail in the brush. It would be suicidal to leave that trail and go off into the long grass on the side of the trail, because there could be practically anything in there. But the trail itself was safe, and just as a reminder that there'd be a piece of a colorful snake every once in a while. Another time in Palenque, the town, they had wooden sidewalks. And I'm walking along one of these wooden sidewalks, and out of a bush on the left comes a scorpion. Scorpion was about yay by yay. I'm pretty sure I have the scale right. Pretty good sized scorpion. And it didn't see me, and I just stood there with my jaw dropped. And it went onto the sidewalk, marched across the sidewalk like it owned that sidewalk, which of course it did in that moment. And then it went over the curb and disappeared into the street. And I'd never seen a scorpion that close up before, not in a cage, right? And it was beautiful. And it had a kind of fierce pride. It reminds me that certain Scorpio individuals that I'm acquainted with, or more than acquainted with, have a kind of fierce pride that you could ascribe to the Scorpio energy. Anyway, there was a living Scorpio walking across the sidewalk. And again, it's accumulation of little things like that that add up, that make a lot of necessary process. When I came back from Mexico, I didn't think about that trip for several years. You know, I had to process the experience a little bit, and then gradually began to work with it. I wrote a paper, 2 of them. This talk is a summary of one of them, and so far I don't think I've forgotten much of anything in terms of the stuff that happened. Yeah, like the locusts, what I wrote. The sun shone so hot, the air moved in rhythms unknown. On the bus into the town from the airport, I was presented with a moving array of impressions. Brightly colored buildings, everyday doings. Everywhere there were piles of dead locusts. I was in the tropics for the first time. And for me so far, there hasn't been a second time, though. I would certainly like to try Bali or Hawaii, and maybe not Brazil. Anyway, that's all water under the bridge. That train has left the station. That flight has taken flight, and I'm still anchored in Olympia, Washington, and pretty well content, even though the travel is off the table. The ruins of Palenque were pretty amazing. In the time before mine on the Gringo Trail, you could unroll your sleeping bag right in front of the pyramids. But they had tightened up, and now they were running herd on it, and they shut down the ruins at night behind iron gates. And I hear through the rumor mill that now the famous Maya Bell campground is no more, that they put a big iron gate down the hill by the town, and the entire area is closed up at night. So my campsite is out of reach, and I don't know how the Mayans that still live in the area deal with that iron gate, but things have tightened. Anyway, in '81, they would close the ruins at dusk. But there was plenty of time during the day. And as I say, I burned copal in the temple called the Palacio. It had a tower. Nobody knows really what it was for. There was the Temple of the Inscriptions, which had incredible Mayan carved hieroglyphs on bas-relief. Very impressive array of buildings in Palenque. The main pyramid has a series of steps down to the below ground level of the pyramid, and in there was the tomb of Lord Pakal, who was one of the famous rulers of Palenque in the days of the classic Maya, probably 800 AD. I don't have my dates together. Somewhere around in there. And Pakal's tomb had a famous picture carved on it, which is now in the Anthropological Museum in Mexico City. But the sarcophagus part was still there. It was behind an iron gate. And one day, I had met the gardener, because I was a frequent visitor. You know, I kept coming back, as I say, 7 times. So I became friends with the gardener, and he was mowing the lawn with a machete. And so I said, "Here, sit under this tree, and I'll mow for a while." And we had talks, and I mowed with the machete. And he said, "We know about lawnmowers, but we don't have any of those here." Yeah, it's like we are aware of the first world, but skeptical about the use of some of this nonsense machinery. Anyway, that's the Mayan attitude. I can't say that I understand it, but I sure love it. Anyway, one of the times I was in a building, and I saw a hieroglyph embedded in the wall, and I looked at it. I thought, that has been reconstructed upside down. Whoever rebuilt that temple from the ruins put it in upside down. And that was the extent of my expertise in Mayan hieroglyphs, right? But I had a good time doing it. There was a time when I was there late, and they were closing the place. And I was already familiar with the layout at the ruins. And as usual, they would prance up and down on the pyramids and blow their whistles, and everybody out, it's closing time. That's part of how you have to function in Mexico. You need to use your rooster. You know, you need to display a little bit of macho now and again. Even though that's not natural to my temperament to be that expressive. You know, it's Latino style. That's how you communicate. So I learned to crow. Anyway, in that case, they were crowing a little bit too much. So I thought, well, I'm not buying it this time. So I hid near Pakal's tomb in the stairwell, and they herded everybody out and shut the gate. And I wanted to go down the trail at the back of the ruins that went down to the road along a beautiful little river, or a little stream. And I'm going to the trailhead, and I run into the gardener. And we look at each other. And we both know I'm breaking the rules. And now he's a potential accomplice. And so it was kind of a standoff, and he decided he'd let me go. So I went. And I thank him to this day for that, for letting me pass at that place, because he could have insisted that I go back to the front gate with the other tourists. Anyway, I started walking down the trail, and it was a beautiful little stream, and it had pools, you know, warmish water, pure water in Chiapas. At least it was in 1981. As I was walking down the trail, I heard a growl. It was a jaguar. And I was all pumped up about the jaguar lore in Mexico, which is extensive. You know, the Maya had the jaguar as a totem animal. My friend, the hieroglyph expert, Barbara McLeod, has a jaguar as her power animal. So I heard the jaguar, and I really wanted to see it. I wanted to meet the jaguar. But I was already way out of my comfort zone, obviously. And I thought I really better not. And to this day, I feel ambivalent about it. Maybe I should have gone the extra distance, but I didn't. Anyway, what I did do, I got down in one of the pools and splashed around in a human rhythm. And, of course, cats avoid humans. So I got up and then walked down the trail, and the jaguar was gone. And I missed an opportunity for interspecies communication, yeah. I missed a number of opportunities that make me wonder, what if? But what actually transpired was I got down to the road and went back to my camp. Other surprising things. And this is straight. This sounds like it's got to be a gold miner's yarn here. I'm walking in from the town at night. I'd probably closed the cantina that night. So I'm walking home along the road, and I see a light in the distance around the corner. Bright light. It's a dark road. There's a bright light. Oh, shit. It's probably a military checkpoint that they set up. And now there's rigmarole to do. So I stood there a while, and I couldn't go into the forest at that point because I'd have got lost. You know, there are not that many trails in there. I did explore that forest in the daytime, but no way I'm going to go in there at night and not know where my feet are. So that wasn't an option. You know, I could go back into town and waste some more time, but it closes down at night. So I think, well, I better just go around the corner. So I went around the corner, and there were two little old French people in white clothes with butterfly nets, if you could believe that. I didn't believe it, but there they were. And what they had done, they had a big searchlight, and they had strung a white sheet, over the light of the searchlight and anchored it on the four corners. And every phototropic insect in that part of the forest ended up landing on that sheet. So the sheet was a solid array of weird bugs. There was a stick bug that long with little feet. You know, it looked like a stick until you saw that it could move. There was a beetle practically the size of the fist with big red eyes. There was an insect maybe that long, a flying insect with mandibles. And what they were doing was finding the beautiful blue butterflies and putting them in formaldehyde and sealing the container and selling them. So they were harvesting butterflies using that method. So we had a conversation. My broken French wasn't quite enough to communicate too thoroughly, but it was certainly an interesting time, and I liked them. They were playing God with the bugs, you know. That was just what the game was for them. So then I went back to my camp. When I was in that inn, I met a fellow. I guess he was Mayan. He had jungle eyes. I can't quite explain what jungle eyes are, but he had them, and he spoke good English. So we had conversations, and at one time he said, "People lives in the jungle, they gets mean." And I took that one to heart. Okay, and now I'm living in the jungle, and I had I didn't tell the tale of the tent. Yes, indeed. No wonder, because it's slightly embarrassing. Back on Isla Mujeres with the Quebecois, one night I drank a huge amount of tequila and got completely raucous all over the place. And I remember as I was going back to my tent, stumbling and falling. And I got up the next morning. Of course, I had a bit of a headache. Can't imagine why. Tequila is ethanol plus cactus, so it has a weird effect. Anyway, someone came to my tent and said, "Senor, last night you broke my tent." And it was that Ecuadorian jeweler. He made jewelry as he went and sold it to make a living. And I realized that I was responsible for that, so I said, "Well, we'll just trade tents." And luckily I had lots of needle and thread. We traded tents, and his tent was thin and dilapidated and almost at the end of its usage. And I took it and gave him mine, which was brand new. And he was appalled when he saw that and gave me some money for it as well, because he realized he was getting a brand new tent. And meanwhile, I've got this old tent that has a big tear in it. So I sewed it up and continued to use it. Well, one time in my camp by Palenque, the tent tore again. And I had to keep sewing it up. It kept tearing. I kept sewing it up. And one time I came back to my camp, I must have had a flashlight because I went into my tent, and there were 2 wolf spiders in there. You know, substantial, big spiders, almost tarantula size, or so I remember. I could have inflated the size of these things, but it's true, everything in the jungle is bigger than it is in the temperate zones. You maybe have seen those little seeds that have one wing on them that rotate in the wind. Well, they're practically fist-sized down there, the same kind of tree, but these huge, they're not quite fist-sized, but they're that big rather than this big. And similarly to the fruit, as I say, the good things are good. Or one time I idly put out the palm of my hand and a fruit fell in it. I don't even know what the name of the fruit was, but it was really good. And then all of a sudden I've got wolf spiders in my tent. Freak out. And I don't like to hurt things, but I sure ushered them out of the tear that they came in, and I probably damaged them, which makes me feel bad even yet. Anyway, then I really sewed up the tent that time and continued on my adventure. Let's see, after Palenque, my boots tore at some point. You know, the heel started coming off of the top. I think that's what it was, or part of the top tore. Don't remember now. Anyway, naturally, there was a cobbler in town. The wrinkle was, they called him the Major, and his cobbler shop was next to the military barracks. And in fact, there was a door from the military barracks through the cobbler shop to the outside street. So the cobbler, who's clearly ex-military or current military, insisted that I sew my own shoe. Or didn't insist, he offered. Do you want to sew your own shoe up? Sure. So he hands me a stitching awl and shows me how to do it. And sure enough, over the course of a couple of days, I stitch up my boot shoe, and I come to the place where it needs to be tied off, and of course I don't know how to do that. And then I realized he was stalling me. And I was almost out of money, and I hadn't done the rest of my adventure yet. So I got uptight and said, go ahead and finish it. And he did. But the atmosphere in there was, of course, totally ridiculous. One time a corporal came through and he was engaging in conversation, and I told him I like to read books. I mean, they were obviously getting to know me, so to speak. And he said, well, you know, there's books of the devil out there. And I said, oh, no, there's no books of the devil. And he says, oh, yes, there are. And I had encountered one, so I knew there were, but I didn't let on. And no, I don't read those kind of books, okay? So my military cobbler did show me how to stitch that boot up, and then I got to the last step, to tying it off, and I had to express my tourist displeasure at the fact that he was delaying me, and I was impatient to continue, partly because I was running out of money, as I said. The major, I think he was a major, was a pretty interesting fellow. I liked him quite a bit, but he was clearly fishing in my psyche, and he talked about the regalito, the little gift, and I forget now the rest of that. And one of the things that he said that indicated a small improvement in my Spanish, he said, más saber menos entender, which means the more you know, the less you understand, which is a very deep saying, right? But the way it was meant in this case is fully aware of the tourist immunity trick of playing dumb when you're in a jam. The more you know, the less you pretend to understand. And if someone challenges you to a macho standoff, you just pretend you don't understand anything, and it passes usually. Okay, so I'm reminded of a time in Valladolid when I had to apply that very principle. And that, again, has to do with the military. I'm wandering around getting drunk, and one night I was running around in the street speaking Chinese, yelling Chinese, in fact. So the next morning I run into a fella called the General. He probably wasn't a general, but he certainly was military. And he's walking me around, and we're talking, and we go into a church, and he mentioned something about Chiang Kai-shek, and I say, yeah, Chiang Kai-shek is a pretty interesting person, and on like that. And then he basically showed me a place where I could buy some beer. And the beer was wrapped in a newspaper. It was a quart, and I paid for it through a little hole in the wall. What a weird setup, because he walked away as soon as... unfortunately my memory is failing me here, but as soon as I got the beer and opened it, it turns out it was somehow illegal. And I think another cop then got on me about that, and I didn't understand what was going on. They did not arrest me. And then I had the interaction with the general, and he said, well, I'm a humane person, indicating I'll let you off the hook. And rather than understanding that, I chose to say, well, I too am a humane person, and blah, blah, blah. And then I said, well, now I have to go to my dinner. Thank you very much. A pleasure meeting you, and walked off. And he let that pass, but I started watching my P's and Q's a little more closely after that. And, it was a stupid thing to have happen. That drink makes you stupid. Luckily, it didn't keep me from having a positive outcome to all my adventures, but it sure came close a time or two. Anyway, the boots were fixed. I got on a bus, and this bus was going to the far edge of the Palenque territory, towards the Usumacinta River, deep into the jungle. And when I got on the bus, it was so full that my feet could barely touch the floor. It was really packed. And when I got out, there was the driver, me, and a Bible salesman. And I got off in the village of Metzabuk. I don't know how I tumbled to that village to go to, but it was the right one. They had a big lake, which was free of liver flukes, and the ruins on the other side of the lake. It turned out I didn't know what I was doing, but I walked into that village, and they received me. I had very little Spanish. Most of them did speak some Spanish as well. And, this happened time and again. I'm sure it happens to professional, serious anthropologists, that they're treated like children because we don't know anything, right? So they say, okay, you want a meal, go to such-and-so's house and ask for a meal. So I go to such-and-so's house, ask for a meal, and they give me a really excellent tortilla and some vegetables. And then, you want a place to sleep? Go and ask such-and-so. And I went and asked such-and-so, and they had a storage shed that was sealed, not one that was open to the forest outside. And it was a perfectly excellent place to sleep. And one of the things that the Maya like to do is poke and prod. Now these, in Metzlebook, these were Lacandon Maya. They're Maya from the deep forest. They're hunters, and very good hunters, and they have an extensive kind of dream lore. I saw a book about their dream lore. But all of the Maya like to poke and prod. They have an interesting sense of humor. One time, and I have to backtrack all the way to Yucatan on this one, but it's worth telling. There's a town called Shkek-En, the well of the swine. And it's a tsonote. A tsonote is a limestone structure that has caved in and filled up with rainwater. So it's a main source of water in the Yucatan, where water is fairly scarce. So this was a big cenote, and you could pay a couple pesos and go to the go into the well and swim around in there. I remember swimming out to the middle of the cenote, and there was a hole in the top of the stone roof, and you could see the blue sky through there. For some reason, views of the sky stick in my mind. After swimming around in the cenote at Shkek-En, I decided to go into the village, and it was my first encounter with the Mayan village. And I got to the village, and the first thing that happened was I was surrounded by ring after ring after ring of people, like half the village had turned out. Some of them had maybe never seen a gringo before. And it's the oddest feeling to be at the center of a circle like that. It's like the energy was neither hostile nor particularly welcoming, at least not in an energy that I could understand, but more open and curious and accepting. So we go into the village, and they, again, I don't know how these conversations took place because I barely knew much Spanish, but they did. They said, "Okay, this is the town parrot," and handed it to me. It'll peck your eyes out, of course, and of course it didn't. But they were testing my courage, right? Because courage is a big thing in my. And now this is the village drum set. You have to play the drum set. So I get on the stool and I bonk around, not knowing what I'm doing, making rhythm on the drum set, and that satisfies them. And they say, "Now it's time for sodas, refrescos." And guess who's buying the refrescos out of the machine with the coin I had, right? So I bought a couple bottles of the Coke, I think it was, and everybody shared some of the refrescos. And I had seen the village, and the village had seen me, and then I went on. That happened again. It's necessary to do another backtrack, but there's no particular reason why this should be chronological in terms of the geography of the journey. Back at Lake Coba, the one with the liver flukes, it's about 30 kilometers inland from Tulum. And Tulum has, as I say, the advantage of the sea breeze that keeps the mosquitoes back. Coba, 30 kilometers inland, has no such advantage. At Coba are some partially excavated ruins. Not certainly as spectacular as Palenque, but pretty interesting. And only the central part of the ceremonial center has been excavated. Off in the distance, one after the other, are piles and piles of stone, which are unexcavated buildings. There was a Mayan village on the shore of Lake Coba and a big fancy hotel. And I went to exploring the ruins, and again I had been forewarned. The mosquitoes in there were fierce, totally fierce. And luckily I was prepared. I had a plastic sack with a pair of shorts and a shirt totally soaked in REI jungle juice. insect repellent. I don't remember the brand. I think it was their house brand, but it was really effective stuff. So I change clothes. I get those shorts on and get that shirt on, and then smear the exposed part of my body with more of that stuff. And I found I could walk through a cloud of mosquitoes and not get one bite. It was totally amazing. So I'm running around the whole day looking at the ruins. I even went to one of those mounds of the unexcavated building and found an entrance and climbed down into them. No rattlesnakes were there. So I got a taste of what archaeologists must feel when they go into somewhere where nobody has been, that comes from a long time back. So I gleaned that impression in an imagistic way. And as I say, I was just playing Mayanist for that 6 months and having a good time doing it. But I went back to the bus stop, and there's a bus stop for you. It's a little general store with people sitting out front of it. And out front of it was a big iron kettle, a podrida as they call them, which you use for a low boil. And this podrida had a bunch of logs stuck under it, making a star-shaped pattern. And what they do, the logs were dry, they were firewood. And there was a fire in the center of the podrida underneath it. And when the tip of the log burned out, they would just push the logs further in so they could keep a low boil going on this podrida. And it was honey that was in there. Honeybees honey, a whole kettle of it. It was, amazing that was going on. And what else was going on was the bus stop there. And so I'm sitting there, hanging out, not saying much, partly because what I could say was limited. And finally, somebody came up to me and said, "Senor, the bus is not coming." And I said, "Huh?" No, they come from Valladolid, and the bus driver has to get to Cancun on time. It's part of the Rooster trip. You have to gloriously enter Cancun in your nice shiny bus. So if they're behind schedule, they skip this stop, since it's quite a few kilometers inland from the main road. And what has happened is the reason the bus is late is it's not coming because they skipped this stop so they could get to Cancun on time. So here I am, dusk. And again, there's an open acceptance and watching. Okay, what's he going to do? Again, neither welcoming nor driving me off, either one. And I looked at the hotel. I couldn't afford that. I did use their library briefly. They had a beautiful library in there, and I think I had breakfast in there, but there's no way I could afford a night in there. So what am I going to do? I thought, well, I could ask these Mayan Indians if there's a place I could sleep. But that didn't seem like what to do either. So what I did do was I went over to the well and lowered my canteen into the well and filled the canteen and looked around and shrugged my shoulders and started walking. And I ended up walking all night. And that's one of the times that I was able to meet the jungle. It was beautiful. The road was straight like a Mayan sakbi. No turns in it at all. So it wasn't possible to lose the track. I just walked in the middle. There were, of course, no cars. No buses either. And one time a Mayan gentleman on a bicycle came out of the pitch dark. And we startled each other, and then he rode off, and I went on. It's an interesting surprise. And I'm walking along on the pitch dark. In the pitch dark, there must have been some light. There was certainly starlight. There was no moon, but there was starlight. And that's the first time I saw the Southern Cross. It's beautiful, And what really intrigued me was Canopus, the navigator's star, famous in ancient Egypt for being the navigator star for those in south latitudes. Beautiful star, yellow, bright. Um, the smell of the jungle off to either side was extraordinary. You know, it's an unusual plant smell. So with the sky overhead and the road ahead, I just kept walking, and I got really tired, and I laid my body out on a log for a while, and then got up and kept walking. And long about dawn, I came to a village, and the people in the village became aware of my presence, and again, they were neither beckoning nor pushing away. And I had the feeling that I had met half the village by the time I came out the other end of the town, you know, just walking out of the night. And at one point, a Mayan woman was out in her yard, tending the cactus or whatever it was growing in there, or tending the yard in some way, and sang an exquisite song as I passed. You know, an amazing tune that was. And I got the impression that of all the people I encountered, they were all somehow interchangeable parts of the village. The village was one person in a certain sense, in a collective sense that we're not used to. So I met the village, I met the entire village by encountering some of its inhabitants. And no words were exchanged, there was no use. I didn't have that many words of my own. Anyway, I ended up back at my camp, no harm done, and a beautiful adventure for that night. I had another night adventure, working on an association. That was when I was back at that camp on the hillock next to Palenque. I was watching the stars at the time, and it was the time of the dark of the moon. And I decided to watch for the night, to stay up all night. And so I kind of pulled everything back from the camp so that I was isolated. It was a symbolic act, you know, but I was making a kind of a watchtower of the hillock in my mind. And in my mind's eye, I saw things that were, of course, not real, but messages from my subconscious about my attitudes towards things that were happening. It was a good time. You know, I had some very positive images emerge. And one of the things that sticks in the mind, many people are familiar with listening to coyote at night if you're camping somewhere, and how the coyotes make a dialogue across the distances, modulating their voices so that sometimes it sounds entirely wild and sometimes it sounds like intelligent conversation, and the cries of the coyotes to each other morph in a way that it goes between those two extremes. Same with jaguars. I started calling them growly kitties. These growly kitties would converse across the distances. And it was the same thing. The modulation would go to something that sounded like intelligent speech. It would modulate into wild animal cries and back into something like sounded like intelligent communication and back again into wildness. And if I hadn't stayed up all that night, I wouldn't have had that impression, that imprint. So that for me was the takeaway portion. The value of that whole journey was those moments where I really did experience something new to me. And of course I had to step out a little bit in order to experience that, but it was certainly worth the risk, in my opinion, especially since the risk didn't result in any disasters to speak of. That first day I was there, one of the things that happened was I'm standing around, and the Lacandon Maya, as they say, were hunters. And they wear long white robes like huipiles. And one of them was posed next to a boat with a machete as a hunter, completely still, but within my view. And again, they're yanking my chain, right? Here's this fierce Indian with a machete that is lying in wait next to this boat, right? Waiting to strike. And, and I didn't buy it, right? That isn't what's going on here. So instead I went down to the shore, and the kids were splashing around in the lake, so I started going swimming with the kids. And they got off on that. That was an all right response to the joke, right? So I'm swimming around with the kids, and then later came the village revenue, and I'm so sad that I didn't have enough money to do it. But they said, we'll take you out to the ruins in a motor launch to see the inscriptions for $20. And I did not have $20 left. The major had charged me an exorbitant amount for the boots, which I paid because it's part of the structure of Mexican pricing. He was displeased with me for being displeased with him, so he charged me a lot of money for the service. So now I'm down below $20, I guess, or in such a way that I couldn't possibly spend $20 and get through the next 2 weeks. So anyway, it was out of the question. And to make matters weirder, I said, no, I can't do that. What I'd like is maybe you can cut a couple of the kids loose and we can paddle over there in a canoe, figuring that wouldn't charge anything, right, because kids don't need money. Well, they said, if you want to do that, you'll have to ask Juan de Escuela, and his hut is up the hill there. So I went up to Juan de Escuela's hut to ask him whether that would be possible. And he was away in the field making milpa, growing corn. But I looked into his hut, and it was extraordinary. There was a beautiful fire pit in the middle of the hut, a couple of key utensils. It had a spiritual glow about it, the whole place. It was marvelous. But unfortunately, I never met the man. Because at that point I realized, okay, I can't go on. I'm going to have to leave town. So I packed up and walked to the bus stop and caught the bus into the jungle further. And it stopped for a turnaround at a place called Naha, which means the House of Waters, again by a big lake. But this lake was not so user-friendly as the one around Metzabo. Anyway, typical arrangement. I'm the only one on the bus with the two kids that are bus drivers. They parked the bus next to a restaurant. I have my first real tortilla, real tortilla, hand ground, exquisitely prepared in this little cafe. Then the kids sprayed down the bus with insecticide, and we went to sleep in it for the night, and then went the schedule back the next morning. For me, the lasting impression is when I decided to walk down to the lake. And as I took the trail near the lake, the bands of growing plants got narrow and narrower. It was like a rainbow spectrum of plants. The microhabitat changed every couple of feet, and as I walked further, it changed every few inches. And there were still rings of different biozones in the mud, falling way past where I could go, and there were different bugs in each ring. So I probably picked up something gnarly at that point, because I ended up with a bad case of dysentery. Anyway, I couldn't reach the lakeshore, but I certainly saw an astounding rainbow of life streams just on that one patch of lakeshore. Again, it was impressions like that that made the trip worthwhile. Okay, meanwhile, I was really SOL. I think I did ask for money, and my parents wired me $100, which was enough to last 2 weeks. I went up to the cloud forest around San Cristobal de las Casas, and went to Tzeltal Mayan marketplace and did some other things with the Highland Maya there as a tourist. And I asked an advice of an old timer who did flights into Tikal and other Mayan ruins that can't be reached readily by road, and asked him his advice, and he said, "Don't be a fool, you can't go to Guatemala now. The refugees are streaming across the border, the death squads are operating, just go back to the States. Leave for the border, leave now." And by that time I was down to a few dollars, and I was sick as a dog with a dysentery. So luckily I had a room in the baño, the public baths, rent rooms. I had a room in there, and so I rode out the illness for a few days. And as soon as I got better enough to travel, then I started out hitchhiking the whole length of Mexico, from practically the Guatemalan border all the way to El Paso and beyond. But that is another story for another episode. I'll record one more description of my adventure hitchhiking the length of Mexico on $3. That's when I really met the Mexicans. For the 6 months I was there for the Maya, but on the way back I met the Mexicans, and they were, lucky for me, very hospitable people. I'll say more about that later. Enough said for the moment.